hearty welcome to this topic, remembering or memory. The ability to remember is a feature of intelligence and a key predictor of academic achievement or success in other activities that depend on intellect. Having a good memory involves being able to readily recall and correctly reuse information. Learning, though occupies a significant place in one's life, will be futile if its products cannot be utilized in the future. Whatever is learned must be stored in the mind in order to be utilized whenever required. According to Ribbon, memory means the power that we have to store our experiences and to bring them into the field of our consciousness sometime after the experience have occurred. How do we remember? Models of memory. Several theories and models have been devised by psychologists to explain how we remember or how memory works. Some of these are briefly discussed here. Storage and transfer model. This model has been suggested by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968 and 1971. In connection with the working of memory, they have suggested three different memory storage systems: sensory stores, a short-term store and a long-term store. The process of memorization starts with the interaction of one's organs with one's environment. The sensory information is first picked up by the sense organs, then it travels through the nervous system and reaches the brain, which interprets it. The sensory message or information must stay or linger in the nervous system briefly to give the brain time to interpret it. This momentary pause of less than a second or lingering or persistence of the sensory information is referred to as sensory storage. According to Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1971, there seems to be a sensory store for each sense: visual, auditory, smell, taste and touch. However, only the visual and auditory storage systems referred to as iconic storage and echoic storage respectively have so far been studied extensively. Sensory information passing through the sensory stores or registers either disappears within a second or is transferred to the short-term store. This short-term store, according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, may be thought of as a stage of conscious activity. The information transferred from the sensory store to the short-term store may automatically stay for up to 20 seconds. However, it can be retained as long as an individual wants it in the short-term store through rehearsal or repetition. In case the short-term store is able to hold or register the information up to 20 seconds, it may move into the long-term store. The short-term store is thus responsible for the transformation of sensory information to the long-term store as well as its retrieval. It also decided which responses should be made. Actually, for this reason, the short-term store is sometimes called the working memory, as this is the memory employed in much of one's mental work. For transferring information from the short-term store to the long-term store, one can make use of many control processes. Rehearsal is one such process, while coding and other mental activities may aid long-term memory much more than simple repetition. In the retrieval, that is recalling what has been stored in the long-term memory also, various control processes and retrieval strategies like decoding of stored information are put into use in the short-term storage. The long-term store is used for storing the sensory information on a permanent basis, while the short-term store contains a limited amount of activated material in current use, the long-term store is assumed to have almost unlimited capacity for the storage of the encoded, currently inactive material. The sensory information is stored or is transformed from short-term memory in the coded form. At the same time of reproduction or retrieval, this is again decoded. The different forms of such coding are linguistic, that is verbal, imaginal and motor. In linguistic coding, the coding of the sensory information is done in the form of language or words. Imaginal coding makes use of images, mental picturization for the storage of information, and the third type of code, the motor code, is employed for remembering physical skills like swimming, cycling, etc. The stored as well as organized information in the long-term store in the coded form is transferred back to the short-term store, where it is decoded and employed. First response as desired and ordered by the brain. Levels of processing model. According to the model of memory designed by Craig and Lockhart in 1972, memory is of only one kind rather than of three types, namely sensory, short-term and long-term, as suggested by Atkinson and Shiffrin. And the ability to remember is dependent on how deeply information is processed by us. Levels of such information processing may range from very shallow to very deep. The greater the depth of processing, the better can the materials be remembered. Let us illustrate what is meant by varying depths of the levels of processing and how it affects one's memory. Let us assume that in one of the experiments, the subject is shown the word chair among some other words on the screen. Later on, as the test of his recognition, he may be asked to respond to questions like, is the word in capital letters? Does the word rhyme with hair? Does it belong to something which may be used for sitting? It may be clearly seen that all of these three questions have been designed to control the level of processing of the word. The first question involves the subject's awareness of its sensory or structural feature of what the word looks. The level of processing at this stage is quite shallow. The next stage involves the subject's awareness of its sensory phonetic feature, the sound of the word. This may be termed as the intermediate level of processing. The last question concerns the task of making an association, that is, assigning a meaning or use to the subject. Here, the level of processing is deep, the kind that may help in forming the strong and more enduring memory trace. Experiments like this may reveal that one's memory performs best when it is processed to deeper levels. Apart from the memory of the verbal material, the theory of the levels of processing can be applied equally well to the memorization of non-verbal material. In one of their experiments, Bauer and Carlin in 1974 showed pictures of people to their subjects and asked them to determine the sex of those persons shown and assess whether they would like those persons. It was found that the subjects were able to remember the faces better when they processed the information related to the second question, that is, judgment of attraction. It was obvious that in judging persons' likability, they had to quite deeper, that is, semantic and meaningful processing than merely judging a person's sex, male or female. Types of memory. The broad classification of memory includes sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. Sensory memory. It is also called immediate memory. It is a memory that helps an individual to recall something immediately after it is perceived. In this type of memory, the retention time is extremely brief, generally from a fraction of a second to several seconds. Old sensory impressions disappear as they are erased by new information. For example, we took up a telephone number from the directory and remember it. But after making the telephone call, we usually forget it. In this case, immediate memory is needed, which helps us to learn a thing immediately with speed and accuracy, remember it for a short duration and forget it rapidly after use. Short-term memory or STM. Information that a person perceives and pays attention to is transferred to the second component of the memory system, the short-term memory. Short-term memory is a storage system that can hold a limited amount of information for a few seconds. It is a part of memory where information currently being thought about is stored. The thoughts we are conscious of having at any given moment are being held in our short-term memory. When we stop thinking about something, it disappears from our short-term memory. Information may enter short-term memory from sensory registers or from the third basic component of the memory system, long-term memory. Often both things happen at the same time. When we see a peacock, our sensory register transfers the image of the peacock to our short-term memory. Meanwhile, we may unconsciously search our long-term memory for information about birds, so we can identify this particular one as peacock. Along with that recognition may come a lot of other information about peacocks, memories of past experiences with peacocks or feelings about peacocks, all of which were stored in long-term memory but are brought into consciousness, that is short-term memory, by our mental processing of the sight of the peacock. One way to hold information in short-term memory is to think about it or say it over and over. You have probably remembered a phone number for a short time this way. This process of maintaining an item in short-term memory by repetition is called rehearsal. Rehearsal is important in learning because the longer an item remains in STM, the greater the chance that it will be transferred to long-term memory. Without rehearsal, items probably will not stay in STM for more than about 30 seconds. Because STM has a limited capacity, information can also be lost from it by being forced out by other information. You have probably had the experience of looking up a telephone number, being interrupted briefly, or finding that you had forgotten the number. Teachers must allocate time for rehearsal during classroom lessons. Teaching too much information too rapidly is likely to be ineffective because unless students are given time to mentally rehearse each new piece of information, later information is likely to drive it out of their short-term memories. When teachers stop a lesson to ask students if they have any questions, they are also giving students a few moments to think over and mentally rehearse what they have just learned. This helps students to process information in short-term memory and thereby to establish it in long-term memory. This mental work is critical when students are learning new difficult material. Long-term memory. Unlike short-term memory, long-term memory has a seemingly limitless capacity to store information with little or no decay and requires little, if any, rehearsal. In addition to these characteristics, long-term memory codes information according to meaning, pattern and other characteristics. It is this memory that helps us to remember a number of things on a relatively permanent basis. Remembering and identifying data like one's name, father's name, date of birth, date of marriage, etc. is some example of long-term memory. With the help of our long-term memory, we can easily store, retain and remember most of the things in our life at a second's notice and thus easily conduct our daily life. Just as information can be stored in long-term memory a long time, so too the capacity of long-term memory seems to be very large. We do not live long enough to fill up our long-term memory. The transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. For many years, psychologists thought of STM and LTM as separate stages. Information first enters STM and stays there a while. If rehearsal kept it there long enough, it would consolidate to form a LTM. Simply rehearsing something in short-term memory is no guarantee that it will become a long-term memory, and how long it stays in STM is a poor prediction of whether it will become a long-term memory. Craig and Watkins in 1972 tried the following experiment. Read the list of the words below to yourself or read them to your friend. Some of the words start with G. The instruction for part 1 of the experiment is to keep track of what is the most recent G word. At the end of the list, you or your friend should say what was the last word on the list that began with G. Table, giraffe, frog, goose, key, window, banana, pencil, spoon, grass, road, garden, house, tree, lake, paper, chick, glove, paint, garlic and stone. The correct answer is garlic, and the experiment assumes that you or your friend had no trouble getting these answers. Note that what you had to do was to store each G word in STM until you dumped it to replace it with the next G word. You had to hold some of the words briefly and others for longer times. Then move to the part 2 of the experiment. The experimenter now wants you to write a list of all the G words on that list. The correct answers are giraffe, goose, grass, garden, glove and garlic. Considering the delay between when you read the words and when you recalled them, we have to assume you recalled them from the long-term memory. The question is, which terms made it into your long-term memory? In general, researchers find that people are about equally likely to remember giraffe, grass and glove, which stayed in short-term memory only briefly, as to remember goose or garden, which had to stay longer in short-term memory before being replaced. Evidently, how long a word stays in short-term memory has little to do with whether it moves into long-term memory. Other types of memory. Theorists divide long-term memory into at least 3 parts: episodic memory, semantic memory and procedural memory. Episodic memory. It contains images of experiences organized by when and where they happen. For example, answer this question. In the house in which you lived as a child, when you entered your bedroom, was then head of your bed to the right, left, away from or pointed towards you? If you are like most people, you answered this question by imagining the bedroom and seeing where the head of the bed was. Now consider the question. What did you do on the night of your senior prom or dance? Most people answer this question by imagining themselves back on that night and describing the events. Finally, suppose you are asked to recall the names of your high school classmates. One psychologist asked graduate students to come to a specific place for 1 hour a day and try to remember the names. Over the course of a month, the students continued to recall new names. Interestingly, they used space and time cues which are associated with episodic memory to imagine incidents that allowed them to recall the names. For example, they might recall the day their social studies teacher came to school dressed as an Arctic explorer and then mentally scan the faces of the students who were there. These demonstrations indicate that images are important in episodic memory and that cues related to space and time help us retrieve information from this part of memory. You probably have taken an exam and said to yourself, I should know this answer. I remember reading this section. It was right on the bottom left corner of the page with the diagram in the upper right. Research has confirmed that people can often remember where information was on the page even if they can't remember the information itself. By Rothkopf in 1970. Episodic memories are often difficult to retrieve because most episodes in our lives are repeated so often that later episodes get mixed up in memory with earlier ones, unless something happens during the episode to make it especially remember. For example, few people remember what they had for lunch at the moment they hears about the Challenger disaster on when John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, or at the moment they received a proposal of marriage may well remember. Semantic memory. It helps in storing as well as retrieving a collection of relationships between events or association of ideas. Examples of such collection may be found in one's ability to recall names of the capitals of different states of the Indian Republic, the meaning of the symbol CO2, the formula for the computation of simple or compound interest, the rules for converting direct narrations into indirect narrations and vice versa, and so on. Semantic memory is thus based on general knowledge coupled with meaningful interpretation, generalized rules, principles and formulae. Semantic memory impressions are more or less permanent. Their recall does not necessarily depend on retrieval of some specific episodes from the past, and semantic memory is therefore not as personal as episodic memory. The meaning of the symbol CO2 and names of the capitals of the states etc. are common to each individual's semantic memory. Procedural memory. It is the ability to recall how to do something, especially a physical task. This type of memory is apparently stored in a series of stimulus-response pairings. For example, even if you have not ridden a bicycle for a long time, as soon as you get on one, the stimuli begin to evoke responses. When the bike leans to the left, that is stimulus, you instinctively shift your weight to the right to maintain balance, that is response. Photographic memory. According to Haber in 1979, the term photographic memory stands for a kind of memory possessed by an individual who can remember a scene in photographic detail. The technical term used for such memory is eidetic imagery. Such people can see a picture after it has been taken away with their descriptions of objects from the picture stating the right color and the proper locations. Paranormal memory. This distinctive and unusual type of memory, popularly known as reincarnation, has emerged as a result of researches and findings in the field of parapsychology. It consists of the unusual memory traces concerning one's previous life or lives that can be partly or completely retrieved by the individual. We can recollect the major ideas discussed in this topic. This chapter provides a comprehensive picture of the process memory, the special faculty of the mind to conserve or retain what has been previously experienced or acquired through learning. In this chapter, it could also be seen the levels of processing model suggested by Craig and Lockhart and Atkinson and Shiffrin storage and transfer model. The three major types of memory, that is sensory, short term and long term, were also discussed along with some other types of memories. Now, can you attempt to answer these questions given here? What is sensory memory? Distinguish LTM and STM. Discuss the different types of long-term memory. How does the transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory occur? What is procedural memory? Now, you may go through these books for reference. Levels of Processing, a Framework for Memory Research by F.I. Craig and R.S. Lockhart in 1972, Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior, 2nd volume, from page number 67 to 684. Introduction to Psychology, Theory and Practice by R. E. Slavin in 1994, USA, Allin and Bacon. Advanced Educational Psychology by S. K. Mangal in 2008, New Delhi, Prentice Hall of India. Thank you for watching this program. Hope that you have enjoyed the session. Take care.